On the cold spring morning of May 1536, as the sun rose over the stone walls of the Tower of London, a deadly silence settled over the fortress. The city beyond those walls was already awake, buzzing with rumours, fear, and morbid anticipation. For the first time in English history, a crowned Queen Anne Boleyn, the wife of Henry VIII, was about to be executed by a foreign swordsman, brought all the way from Calais. Few knew the truth of what was happening that day. Even fewer understood the terror she endured in the hours leading up to her death. What history later softened or simplified was, in reality, a sequence of events marked by isolation, psychological torment, political betrayal, and a chillingly personal fear that she would die brutally, painfully, and publicly humiliated. The scaffold had been built on Tower Green, a rare honour reserved only for noble blood, yet the privilege was hollow. The wood still smelled fresh from yesterday's rain. Soldiers paced slowly, halberds in hand, watching the gates for any sign of last-minute mercy. But the truth was already sealed. Anne Boleyn would die today no matter what the crowd hoped, no matter how fiercely she had defended herself at her sham trial, and no matter how desperately she prayed that her final breath might somehow change the kingdom's future. To understand why this moment became one of the most shocking executions in European history, we must step back 10 years to the time when England and Rome were at war, not with swords, but with ideology. Anne Boleyn was not an ordinary queen. She was a revolution. Her rise created a fracture in Western Christendom, breaking England from the authority of the Pope and placing unprecedented religious and political power directly into the hands of Henry VIII. Many adored her, many hated her, but no one could ignore her. Anne first caught Henry's eye around 1525, at a moment when the king's desperation for a male heir was becoming a matter of national crisis. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, had given him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. For a medieval monarch, this was not simply a personal misfortune. It threatened dynasty, stability, and the future of England itself. Anne Boleyn, with her sharp intellect French, court polish, and bold refusal to become the king's mistress, used her position carefully. She believed that if she were to give herself to Henry, it must be as his lawful wife, a daring stance for a woman in a world where refusing a king usually meant exile. Henry's obsession with Anne escalated into a political earthquake. He pleaded with Rome for an annulment from Catherine. He argued, he threatened, he negotiated, but the Pope, pressured by Catherine's powerful nephew Emperor Charles V, refused. What happened next changed the course of world history. Henry broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne in secret in January 1533. By June, she was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey, pregnant with the child Henry believed would finally be his son. But fate had other plans. In September 1533, Anne gave birth not to a prince, but to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I. Henry masked his disappointment publicly, but behind closed doors his mood darkened. Anne, fiercely intelligent and politically opinionated, clashed with advisers, ambassadors, and even Henry himself. By 1534, factions at court had already begun plotting her fall. The tragedy deepened in 1536, when Anne miscarried a male fetus, an event that Henry interpreted as a divine sign that their marriage was cursed. At that same moment, one of Henry's childhood friends, Jane Seymour, emerged as a quiet, submissive presence at court. Henry began to see her as a potential wife, someone who could give him the son he craved while restoring the obedience he believed he had lost with Anne. All Anne's enemies needed was an opportunity. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, orchestrated a plot so ruthless and efficient that modern historians still debate its origins. Within weeks, Anne was accused of treason, adultery, incest, and conspiring to kill the king. The charges were not only outrageous but physically impossible in many cases. Yet the machinery of Tudor justice moved swiftly and mercilessly. 5 men, including Anne's own brother George Boleyn, were arrested and tortured for confessions. None confessed, but Cromwell didn't need truth, he needed compliance. Anne was arrested on 2 May 1536 and taken by barge to the Tower of London. The same rooms where she had once been celebrated before her coronation now became her prison. As she crossed the Traitor's Gate, she reportedly sank to her knees and cried that she was the king's true wedded wife, insisting she would defend her honor to the end. Her trial on 15 May was a spectacle filled with nobles who already knew the verdict. Anne defended herself brilliantly, denying every charge, exposing contradictions in the witnesses' testimonies, and reminding the court of her loyalty. But the outcome was predetermined. She was sentenced to be burned alive or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Henry chose the sword, believing it to be cleaner, quicker, and more merciful. Yet it also carried symbolic cruelty. Anne would be executed not as a commoner, but as a queen yet stripped of dignity in front of a watching world. The night before her death, Anne could barely sleep. Contemporary reports describe her praying, speaking softly to her ladies, and experiencing moments of trembling fear. Unlike later romanticized accounts, the real Anne was terrified. She had seen how brutally people could die on English scaffolds. She feared the blow might be clumsy, that she might feel pain, that her death would be slow and agonizing. The French executioner, known only as the Calais swordsman, was already waiting, said to be the finest in Europe. But even this did not comfort her. She knew that once she stepped outside her chamber, there would be no return. On the morning of her execution, Anne dressed carefully in a dark gown with an ermine-trimmed mantle. She refused a priest's offer of final confession, insisting that she had been faithful to Henry. Her last walk across Tower Green was witnessed by nobles, courtiers, and soldiers, most of whom avoided her gaze. No one dared show sympathy, but what happened next, the moments leading to her execution, were far more terrifying than the polished tales later told by chroniclers. Fear, betrayal, false hope, and a chillingly intimate awareness of death surrounded her final steps. As Anne Boleyn stepped onto Tower Green, the gentle breeze that moved across the open space felt colder than it should have been in late May. The sun was rising higher, casting long shadows from the high walls onto the freshly swept wooden scaffold. The small crowd gathered there consisted mostly of nobles, handpicked by the King's Council to witness the downfall of the woman who had once changed the destiny of England. Ordinary citizens were not allowed. The execution of a queen was too politically charged, too dangerous for uncontrolled public reaction. Every pair of eyes fixed upon Anne in that moment saw a woman diminished in status, but not in spirit. What they could not see was the depth of her fear, contained behind an outward calm she struggled desperately to maintain. Her ladies, in waiting, trembling and red-eyed from sleepless nights, followed her silently. They had spent the last hours preparing her, fastening her gown, smoothing her veil, brushing her hair, and handing her the prayer book she clutched now. These women loved her deeply, and the knowledge that they would be forced to handle her body after the execution added a horrific weight to the mourning. But they had no choice. In Tudor England, duty did not end when a royal heart stopped beating. Anne moved with quiet dignity, though inside she was fighting a battle between resignation and the desperate, irrational hope that at last, pardon might yet arrive. Such pardons had come before for nobles who fell from favour. Henry VIII had once been a man who adored her beyond measure. Could he not send a messenger racing across the courtyard even now? Could he not spare her life, exile her to a convent, or banish her to France? But the truth had already hardened. Henry had erased her from his future. Her daughter Elizabeth had even been declared illegitimate. Mercy was as distant as Rome. The French executioner stood at a respectful distance, dressed simply and without the black hood traditionally worn by English headsmen. His sword, long and narrow, gleamed in the sunlight. He had been specially trained to deliver a single, swift stroke with precision. Anne had been informed earlier that she would not need to kneel upright on the block like typical English executions. Instead, she would kneel upright without a block at all, allowing her neck to extend naturally. This was meant to ensure a clean beheading. It was considered an act of mercy, but to Anne it only served as a chilling reminder that she was to die in a way unlike anyone before her. As she reached the scaffold, Anne paused. A hush fell over the courtyard so complete that even the distant sounds of London blacksmith hammers, horse carts, calls of merchants seemed to disappear. In that silence, Anne gathered what strength she had left and addressed the crowd. Her voice, according to eyewitnesses, was soft but steady, carrying a strange mixture of sorrow and unexpected gratitude. She praised Henry, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord, insisting she prayed for him and wished him a long life. Her words, to modern readers, sound like submission. But to those who understood the danger of speaking openly against the king, they were a final attempt to protect her daughter from future ruin. Any hint of defiance might condemn Elizabeth further in the eyes of the court. As Anne finished her final words, she knelt gracefully on the scaffold, lifting her gown slightly to keep the fabric from bunching at her knees. Her ladies stepped forward, removing her mantle and placing a linen cap over her hair to expose her neck. Tears streamed down their faces as they worked, but Anne's eyes remained calm. She did not look at them long, knowing that doing so would break her resolve. Instead, she turned her gaze forward, toward the small wooden railing where a few solemn nobles stood, their expressions unreadable. The executioner approached quietly, his movements almost rehearsed to minimize her fear. Anne, still kneeling, began to pray softly under her breath. Witnesses later claimed they could hear fragments of her whispered words, "Jesus, receive my soul," repeated again and again, as if her mind was clinging to the last anchor of comfort she had left. But even in her prayer, the terror beneath her composure flickered. She had seen the sword. She knew that she would have to remain absolutely still. Any movement could turn a moment of death into a moment of suffering. What many history books do not reveal is the psychological tactic the French executioner used at that moment. He signaled to one of his assistants and called out in French to fetch his sword, tricking Anne into turning her head slightly. The sword was already hidden behind his back, and as she instinctively moved her gaze toward the supposed direction of the weapon, the executioner stepped lightly around her. It was the final deception, intended to catch the condemned completely unaware. The logic was both practical and cruel. An unprepared victim would not flinch. Flinching could mean agony. A clean beheading required perfect stillness. Anne likely realized the trick only when it was too late to react. Her breath caught for one final moment. Her fingers tightened around each other, and then, in that single heartbeat between life and death, the sword flashed in a swift arc. The blade, sharpened to near perfection, passed so quickly that many observers did not even see the motion. They only heard the sudden, horrifying sound of steel cutting through the air, followed by a heavy thud as Anne's severed head fell onto the straw that had been carefully spread across the scaffold. Her ladies screamed, collapsing to their knees. Some fainted. Others rushed forward, gathering her body and head with shaking hands, wrapping them in clothing soaked instantly with blood. There was no coffin prepared for her. Everything had been rushed. The women carried her to the chapel royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, still warm, still bleeding, still impossibly human. For the crowd, the execution was over in seconds. But for Anne's attendants, the horror continued long after the sword was lowered. As the soldiers cleared the area, the nobles dispersed, and the executioner wiped his blade. The reality of Anne Boleyn's death began to settle like dust in the corners of the tower. The queen who had once held Europe in suspense, the woman who had challenged Rome, changed religion, and become the mother of a future monarch, now lay lifeless under a stone floor with no monument and no ceremony. Yet beyond the tower's walls, the consequences of her death were already rippling outward. Henry VIII, who only days earlier had smiled through jousts and feasts as if nothing weighed upon his conscience, was preparing for a new wedding. Jane Seymour waited at court, quiet, obedient, and chosen to be the next vessel for Henry's hope of a male heir. Anne's death was not merely the fall of a queen. It was the turning of a tide in English history, a tide that would sweep through every corner of the kingdom, every church, every noble house, and every future generation. News of Anne Boleyn's execution spread with astonishing speed, travelling from the Tower to Westminster, from merchant stalls to noble halls, and eventually across Europe within days. England, already divided over religion, felt another deep fracture forming beneath its feet. But while ordinary people whispered in taverns and scribes copied reports for foreign diplomats, Henry VIII himself was already turning the page. To him, Anne was no longer a queen, nor a wife, nor even a memory worth lingering over. The machinery of politics moved forward without pause, yet the true consequences of Anne's execution would unfold slowly, shaping the destinies of her daughter, her enemies, and even the king who condemned her. What seemed like the swift elimination of a troublesome queen became, in the long arc of history, the beginning of a profound transformation in England. Just hours after Anne's death, Henry travelled to dine with Jane Seymour, the woman who would soon become queen. His reputation for emotional volatility became even clearer that day. For a man who once wrote poetry for Anne, who courted her relentlessly for nearly 7 years, and who changed the religious structure of an entire kingdom to marry her, he showed no public grief. Instead, he acted as though a burdensome chapter had ended. To those who understood his nature, it was a chilling reminder of the king's belief that the monarchy did not merely rule England, it embodied it. Queens were replaceable, dynasties were not. Meanwhile, inside the Tower, Anne's ladies remained in shock. They cleaned the blood from the scaffold, washed her garments as best they could, and carefully placed her body in a crude elm chest meant originally to store arrows. No coffin had been prepared. No official had thought it necessary. Her burial in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was hurried, quiet, and without the ceremony afforded even to lesser nobles. Those who attended later described it as one of the most sombre moments in Tudor memory. The tragedy deepened when the people realized that Anne's real crime had never been treason, adultery, or incest. It had been failure to produce a living male heir. In the ruthless logic of Tudor politics, that was unforgivable. It overshadowed her intelligence, her reforms, her patronage of scholars, and her influence on England's break with Rome. All the accusations against her were fabrications designed to eliminate her cleanly and swiftly, crafted by Cromwell with the precision of a seasoned statesman. Even some of her enemies privately admitted that the evidence was absurd. But the truth did not matter when the king himself demanded resolution. Beyond England's borders, foreign courts reacted with a mixture of shock, confusion, and thinly veiled satisfaction. Catherine of Aragon's supporters, particularly in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, viewed Anne's execution as divine justice against the woman they believed had usurped a rightful queen. Reports from imperial ambassadors described the event as a warning to any woman who sought to rise above her station through charm or ambition. But others saw it differently. They saw a young queen destroyed by the very forces she had helped unleash. In France, where Anne had spent formative years at the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude, her execution was received with sorrow. French diplomats, who had always respected her intellect and grace, wrote letters describing her death as a tragic end for a woman who had once seemed destined to be Europe's most influential queen. Even the French king, Francis I, expressed private shock at the speed and brutality of her downfall. Inside England, the impact was even more profound. For those who supported religious reform, Anne had been a symbol of a new era. She encouraged the translation of the Bible into English. She protected reformist scholars, and she pushed Henry to consider policies that shifted the nation away from Catholic tradition. Her death sent a chilling message. Anyone, even a queen who once commanded the king's full devotion, could fall without warning. Thomas Cromwell, who orchestrated her downfall, gained enormous power immediately after the execution. His influence over the king grew, and for a brief time he seemed untouchable. But the very forces he manipulated would later turn against him, leading to his own execution just 4 years later. In Tudor politics, the blade of fate swung swiftly and unpredictably. Anne's execution also altered the future of her daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Declared illegitimate by Parliament, she lost her place in the line of succession. Her household was reduced, her status diminished, and her future uncertain. Yet even at a young age, Elizabeth possessed a sharpness of mind and a resilience that foreshadowed her later greatness. What she lacked in royal favor, she compensated for with intelligence, discipline, and the ability to navigate a dangerous court with caution beyond her years. Elizabeth's downfall mirrored her mother's in several painful ways. She was watched closely, she was distrusted, she was viewed as a threat by those who feared the Boleyn family's return to power, but she survived. And decades later, she would not only rise to the throne, but rule so successfully that her reign became known as the Golden Age. Ironically, the daughter of the Queen, executed for failing to produce a son, became one of history's greatest monarchs. As for Henry, his decision to execute Anne haunted him more than he ever admitted. In the months after her death, he spoke little of her, except to justify the execution or dismiss her memory entirely. But private letters and court observations suggest that the manner of her death weighed on him. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. His trust in Cromwell, once solid, began to erode. His marriages became shorter, more fragile, more suspicious. His paranoia grew. In the decades that followed, historians would debate whether Henry truly believed the accusations against Anne, or whether he allowed political pressure and personal disappointment to blind him. Modern scholars generally agree that Henry chose to believe whatever narrative allowed him to move forward without guilt. For a man convinced of his divine right, self-doubt was intolerable. The repercussions of Anne Boleyn's execution extended far beyond the Tudor court. The break with Rome she helped solidify became permanent. The English Reformation continued with renewed force. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands were seized, religious identity in England shifted dramatically, creating tensions that would last for centuries. Anne had become a martyr of political ambition, religious transformation, and personal betrayal. Her death marked not the end of her story, but the beginning of her legend. Writers, chroniclers, and diplomats across Europe recorded the event with fascination, disgust, sorrow, and sometimes admiration. The more the Tudor regime attempted to bury her memory, the more powerful it became. She was no longer merely a queen. She became a symbol of how ambition could rise and fall in the blink of an eye, how a nation's destiny could hinge on the desires of a single king, and how truth could be reshaped by those in power. But the most terrifying part of Anne Boleyn's story was yet to come, not in the physical act of her execution, but in the silent, haunting aftermath and the political reckoning that followed. The shadow of her death would reach into every corner of the Tudor dynasty and alter the path of English history forever. In the weeks that followed Anne Boleyn's execution, England entered a strange period of forced celebration and uneasy silence. On the surface, the court rejoiced. Bells rang across London when Henry VIII married Jane Seymour only 11 days after Anne's death. Courtiers smiled, ambassadors offered congratulations, and the king appeared triumphant. Yet beneath these cheerful performances lay a deeper, more unsettling truth. A queen had been killed on charges no honest court could believe, and the nation felt the tremor of that injustice echo through every household, church, and political chamber. The people did not dare speak openly, but the shock lingered. Anne had become both a warning and a mystery. Rumors spread that she died with more dignity than any execution the Tower had seen. Some whispered that she looked almost serene as she walked to her death, as if she knew history would remember her differently than her enemies intended. Others spoke of strange signs, birds circling above the chapel during her burial, a sudden gust of wind that rattled the scaffold, the uneasy expressions on the faces of the nobles chosen to witness her end. To a deeply superstitious age, such details carried powerful meaning, but the most lasting consequences were political. Anne Boleyn's execution marked the point where Henry VIII crossed an invisible threshold. Before her death, he had been a king wrestling with conscience, torn between love, duty, and religious upheaval. After her death, he became a ruler hardened by the belief that his will alone defined justice. For the rest of his reign, Henry's decisions grew more unpredictable. Anyone who challenged him risked sharing Anne's fate. The message was clear: kings did not err, only subjects did. The transformation of England continued aggressively. Anne's downfall removed one of the strongest supporters of reform from Henry's side. But it did not halt the movement she helped ignite. Her influence lived through the scholars she had sponsored, through the English Bible she had advocated, and through the ministers who had risen during her queenship. Even as Henry remarried and attempted to rewrite recent history, the religious path Anne had supported steered England toward a Protestant identity that would define the coming century. Thomas Cromwell, who engineered Anne's destruction, quickly realized that his victory contained the seeds of his own ruin. He had overplayed his influence. Under Henry's suspicious eye, success was dangerous. While Cromwell expanded his power after Anne's fall, he soon discovered that eliminating a queen did not guarantee the king's gratitude. Henry's loyalty shifted with his moods. Within 4 years, Cromwell himself was executed, ironically after being blamed for arranging Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a match Henry despised. The blade that had once removed a queen now claimed the man who had wielded political authority to make it happen. Anne's shadow seemed to stretch even into the downfall of her destroyer, but perhaps the most striking legacy of Anne's death was the fate of her daughter, Elizabeth. Declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession, she became a quiet presence on the margins of the royal family. Yet even as a child, Elizabeth displayed the fierce intellect and cautious temperament that would later define her reign. Those who taught her observed a sharp mind, an intense curiosity, and a resilience remarkable for someone who had been cast aside. Some believed that losing her mother at 2 years old and growing up in a court filled with whispers and danger shaped her into a ruler uniquely capable of navigating treacherous politics. Elizabeth rarely spoke of Anne Boleyn in adulthood, but her actions suggested a silent tribute. She embraced learning, diplomacy, and religious moderation, values Anne had cherished. She carried herself with the same commanding presence that ambassadors once associated with Anne's years at the French court. And when Elizabeth finally ascended the throne in 1558, she chose to be crowned with the imperial crown, a bold symbol of sovereignty. It was as if she lifted not only herself, but also her mother's memory from the shadows of disgrace to the light of triumph. Anne's execution had intended to erase her. Instead, it immortalized her. Writers of the Tudor age struggled to interpret her story. Some portrayed her as a seductress who manipulated a king and fell by her own ambition. Others saw her as a tragic heroine destroyed by the political machine she helped set in motion. As the years passed, her legacy evolved. Historians recognized the profound injustice of the charges against her. Legal scholars studied her trial as an example of political manipulation. Feminist thinkers of later centuries saw her as a symbol of a woman punished for intelligence, independence, and refusing to submit quietly. Even the Tower of London, once the site of her terror, became a place where tourists sought to stand on the ground where she had drawn her last breath. The chapel where she was buried anonymously later received a memorial plaque in her honor. Her remains, once hastily placed in an arrow chest, became part of a story retold generation after generation, each retelling attempting to understand the woman who changed England by simply existing at the wrong time and threatening the wrong men. The terror of her execution lay not only in the physical act itself, but in the way her enemies attempted to erase her humanity. They silenced her voice, removed her crown, condemned her name, and reduced her memory to accusations. But history refused to cooperate. The further time moved from that morning in 1536, the more Anne's image grew. Paintings long believed lost were rediscovered. Letters she wrote resurfaced in archives. Scholars traced her influence in places even her contemporaries had overlooked. Her story became a testament to the idea that truth, even when buried under political lies, finds a way to rise again. Henry VIII, for all his power, could not control how future generations would view Anne Boleyn. He could silence her in life, but not in memory. In the centuries after his death, it was not his beloved Jane Seymour who dominated historical fascination, nor Catherine of Aragon, nor even his powerful ministers. It was Anne, the queen executed on fraudulent charges, the mother of a future monarch, the spark of a religious reformation, and the woman whose courage in the face of terror became legendary. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies in its chilling blend of injustice, political ambition, and personal betrayal. She died because a king demanded a son, a court demanded stability, and a minister demanded survival. She died because in the world she lived in, a queen could be unmade faster than she could be crowned. She died because the power she helped elevate ultimately crushed her. Yet the ultimate consequence of her death stands as one of history's greatest ironies. Her daughter, the child whose birth had disappointed Henry, became the very embodiment of the monarch he so desperately sought. Strong, wise, commanding, and deeply loved by her people. Elizabeth's reign proved that Anne's legacy did not end on the scaffold. It lived through the brilliance and endurance of the daughter she never saw grow. It lived through England's transformation into a Protestant nation. It lived through every historian who questioned the false charges crafted against her. And it lives today in the endless fascination with the woman who, even in death, refuses to be forgotten. Anne Boleyn walked to her execution believing her story was ending. Instead, she stepped into immortality. Her fall shook the foundations of England, but her memory shaped its future. In the cold morning light of 19 May 1536, a sword ended her life, but history ensured that her voice, silenced by force, would echo far louder than those who condemned her ever imagined.